At 58, she answered the only ad that didn't ask her age. He kissed the letter. The letter came on a Thursday. I know it was Thursday because Thursday was the day Yellow Hawk rode the post route from Bismarck, and he always tied his horse at the same post, loose, the way a man ties a horse he expects to leave in a hurry. I was splitting wood behind the agency house when I heard the hooves, and I didn't stop. I kept the axe moving. I had learned, a long time before, not to stop what you are doing for news you haven't heard yet. Yellow Hawk left the post sack on the porch and rode on without calling out, which meant nothing in it required my immediate attention. That was how we had worked it out, him and me. If there was a government order, he'd say my name. If there was just letters, he'd leave it quiet. I finished the wood, stacked it against the north wall of the house, the way my father had taught me, broad side out, dry side in, a finger's width between each piece so the air can work. Then I washed my hands at the barrel and went inside. There were 3 letters in the sack. 2 from the Indian Bureau in Washington. I recognized their envelopes, that thin government paper that tears before you even open it right, and the seal always a little crooked like whoever pressed it didn't care. The 3rd was different. Heavier paper, a woman's hand firm and unhurried. My name written out in full, Caleb Iron Horse, care of the Lakota Agency, Dakota Territory, not the shortened thing the government used, not the name they'd written on the enrollment papers that turned my father's name into something that fit their pen. My full name. I set the bureau letters aside. The return address said, Mrs. Dorothea Prout, General Delivery, Laramie, Wyoming. I did not open it right away. I made coffee. I sat down at the table my grandfather had made. He traded 4 horses for the wood and planed it himself, and you could still see his plane marks on the underside if you looked, long, slow strokes, patient, the grain running clean, and I held the letter and looked at it a while. My name in full, written by a woman I had never met. I had placed the advertisement in 3 papers, the Bismarck Tribune, the Cheyenne Leader, and a small weekly out of Laramie whose name I have since forgotten. The notice was short. I had written it myself, sitting at this same table, 3 drafts before I found words that didn't sound like a man trying to sell himself or trying to beg. Caleb Iron Horse, 63, Lakota, Agency Superintendent, Dakota Territory. Widower. House with land, modest provision, steady work. Seeking a woman of good character and independence who wants a plain life with a reliable man. Correspondence welcome. I had not said what I looked like. I had not said I was Lakota the way some men in the territory advertised it as a novelty, or as a warning, or as some kind of explanation for why they were advertising at all. I put it plain because it was plain, and I did not ask for age. I did not ask for beauty. I said good character and independence because those were the things I had found mattered, and the things I had found you could not replace once a woman had them or invent them once she didn't. 41 letters came in the first 3 weeks. I read every one. Most of them were from women in their 20s and 30s, which surprised me. I had expected the young ones to pass right over an advertisement from a man my age. Some of them were kind letters, genuinely kind, but they wanted things I couldn't offer. A town with a school, a church they recognized, neighbors who spoke their language. One woman had written 6 pages in a hand so small I had to hold the paper to the window to read it, and it was 6 pages about what she expected from a husband. She was not wrong in any of her expectations. She just wasn't writing to me. Some of the letters stopped when they got to the word Lakota. I could feel it, a letter that had been going somewhere suddenly going nowhere, the sentences tightening up, the warmth pulling back. I didn't hold it against them. The world is what it is. A woman sitting in her parlor in St. Louis or Omaha had heard things about the territory, about the Lakota, and some of those things were even true, and I could not blame her for being cautious with her one life. But 41 letters, and not one of them had written my name in full. Then came the letter from Laramie. Dear Mr. Iron Horse, I am writing in response to your notice in the Laramie paper dated the 14th. I am 58 years old. I will say that first because most advertisements ask for it somewhere, and yours did not, and I appreciated that enough to say it plainly so you can decide now whether to keep reading. My name is Dorothea Prout. I was married for 22 years to a man named George Prout, a surveyor, who died of a chest illness 3 years ago this coming March. We had no children. We had a house in Laramie, and before that a season in Colorado, and before that 2 years in Kansas. I know the territory. I know what a plain life in it looks like, and I am not afraid of it. I do not know what you look like, and I do not especially care, as long as you are healthy and honest. I am neither young nor beautiful, and I say that with no shame attached to it. I am practical, I cook well, I do not tire easily, I read when I can, and I have been told I am good company if you don't need a lot of noise around you. What I am looking for, and I will be as plain as your advertisement was, is a man who is reliable and decent, who will not lie to me, and who wants a real companion rather than a housekeeper with papers on her. I am not looking to be provided for so much as to be part of something that works. I am a widow and I am 58, and I expect that most men who read this will not write back. That is all right. But you asked for a woman of good character and independence, and I believe I am that, and so I am writing. Respectfully, Dorothea Prout. I read it twice. Then I set it down and looked at the wood grain on my grandfather's table. Then I picked it up and read it again. I have held a few things in my life that felt right the moment I had them. A rifle that balanced the way a rifle should, a horse that settled into your grip without argument, a treaty document that said what it meant in plain language, though there were precious few of those. That letter felt like that. It had a weight to it. It had been written by a person who knew what they were doing. I put it inside the cover of the book I was reading, A History of the Surveying of the Missouri River Basin, which I expect now she might have found funny, given her husband's work, and I carried it with me for 2 days before I wrote back. I kissed it. I am not a man who does things like that, and I am aware of how it sounds, but I kissed the top of the page before I put it in the book, and I didn't think about why until later. Later I understood. It was the first time in 3 years I had touched something that felt like it was reaching toward me. Not past me, not through me. Toward me. A woman who saw my name, written out and kept reading. I should tell you about my life before I tell you about hers coming into it, because otherwise none of the rest makes sense. I was born in 1823 on the land that the government now calls the Great Sioux Reservation, though I was born there before it was called anything by anyone except us. My mother was Hunk Papa Lakota. My father was the son of a French trader and a Lakota woman, and he grew up between two worlds the way a man grows up between two rivers, knowing both currents, belonging fully to neither. He gave me his French surname, Iron Horse, which was also what some of the elders called the locomotive, and he thought that was funny, and the name stayed. I was educated at a mission school in Minnesota. I did not choose to go, but I was not given the choice, and later I found that the education was something I was glad I had, even if the manner of its giving had been wrong. I learned to read English and write it and speak it without the accent that made white men comfortable in their condescension, that smooth-it-over accent, the one that lets them think you're not quite what you are. I kept my Lakota. I kept it the way you keep a fire low on a night when you don't want to be found, not out, never out, but banked. I worked for 20 years as an interpreter and agency liaison. That is the polite word for what I did. The full picture of it is that I spent 20 years standing between my people and the government, translating not just words but intentions, and watching the intentions on the government side run counter to the words almost every time, and trying to hold the thing together with whatever I could put my hands on. Patience, mostly. Information. Occasionally, the kind of stubbornness that looks like patience but isn't. My wife was named Walk's Far Woman. She was from the Oglala Band, and she had come north with her family when the southern ranges were closing. We were married in 1855. She was 23 and I was 32, and she had a laugh that you could hear from the other side of a river in flood. We had 21 years together. We had a son who died at 4 of a fever, and I am not going to speak much about that because some things you carry and you do not put down in words. Walks Far woman died in 1876, the year of the greasy grass. And if you want to know what happened that year and what it cost the Lakota, what it cost the families on both sides, what it cost a man who had spent 20 years believing that patience and information and stubbornness could hold the center, I cannot give you an account that would fit into words you could hear without flinching. After she died, I kept working because it was the only thing I knew to do. I became the agency superintendent at Standing Rock in 1879. That is a title that means the man the government trusts enough to leave in charge of the forms and the rations and the enrollment lists and the endless correspondence, and whom the Lakota trust enough not to run off, and who lives in the space between those two facts and makes of it what he can. I had not thought about a woman again for years. I want to be clear about that. I was not a man sitting in loneliness composing an advertisement out of desperation. I was a man who had done what he'd needed to do and who had arrived, sometime around his 62nd year, at the recognition that the house he lived in was large enough for 2 people, and that he had been a good enough husband once that he might be one again. Not yearning, something more like looking up from the work and seeing what was there. The advertisement was deliberate. Everything I have ever done has been deliberate. That is the one thing I know how to be. I wrote back on the second day. Dear Mrs. Pruitt, thank you for writing. Your letter is the plainest I have received and also the best, and I have been carrying it around for 2 days trying to decide how to answer it, which I take as a good sign. I am 63. I am in reasonable health for my age, which I attribute to work and to not drinking. My hair has gone gray and I have kept my weight. I live in a frame house on the agency grounds, 2 rooms downstairs, 2 up, a kitchen that functions and a porch that faces west. The winters here are hard. That is not something I can talk around. You say you want a real companion rather than a housekeeper with papers on her. I will say the same back to you. I am not looking for a housekeeper or for a woman to fill a particular role because the role is vacant. I am looking for a person I want to talk to at the end of the day. If you are willing, I would like to keep writing, and I would like to ask you one question if I may. What do you read? Respectfully, Caleb Iron Horse. She answered in 8 days. 8 days from Laramie, which was fast. She must have replied almost by return post. Dear Mr. Iron Horse, what do I read? I read history when I can find it. I read whatever George left on the shelf when he died, which included 3 volumes of Lewis and Clark's journals, a surveying manual I have read twice for reasons I cannot fully explain, and a novel in French that I cannot read but keep meaning to learn. I read the newspaper when it is accurate, which is not always. I read seed catalogs in the winter, which is something I have never admitted to anyone. What do you read? Respectfully, Dorothea Pruitt. P.S. You asked 1 question. I am going to ask 2. P.P.S. Does the porch get the sunset? I sat at my grandfather's table with that letter for a long time. Then I laughed. I don't know when I had last done that, laughed at something in a letter, laughed at something that wasn't a dark joke about government policy or a piece of gallows humor between 2 men who had seen too much. I laughed at a woman I had never met asking whether my porch got the sunset, and at the way she'd stacked her postscripts like she was making up rules as she went. The porch did get the sunset. Every evening from April through October, the light came off the Missouri flats and hit the west-facing boards and turned the whole thing the color of old brass. I had watched it most nights for 4 years. I had not thought to mention it in the advertisement. I wrote back the same day. I told her I read whatever I could get, history, government reports, anything on the law of the territory. I told her I had been reading the same history of the Missouri River Basin for 3 months because I kept setting it down to answer correspondence. I told her the porch faced due west, and that in September the light off the flats hit the boards at about 5 in the afternoon and stayed for 40 minutes, and that a man who had lived with that for 4 years would have mentioned it in the advertisement if he'd thought anyone would care. Her next letter came back in 6 days. She said, "That is the first sunset I have wanted to see in 3 years." And then, in a postscript, George never noticed sunsets. He noticed the angle of the light as it pertained to reading his instruments. That is a different thing entirely. I am telling you the letters in order because the order mattered. It was not the accumulation that built it, not the pile of paper that grew over 4 months, but the sequence. Each letter was a step, and the step was made before you knew where the ground would be, and yet the ground kept being there. That is what I remember, not the sum of it but the particular act of stepping, again and again, and finding the other person had already laid something for your foot to land on. She told me about her years in Kansas. About a winter there when the storms came in from the north for 6 weeks without stopping, and the nearest neighbor was 4 miles, and she and George had not spoken to another person for 31 days because the roads were impassable and the horses wouldn't go out in it. She said she had not found it frightening. She had found it clarifying. She said, "I learned what I could make inside my own head for 31 days, and I found it was enough." I told her about the winter of 1880, the worst I had seen at Standing Rock, 40 below for 3 weeks. We lost 2 elders and a child, and there was not enough fuel because the supply wagons couldn't get through the drifts, and I spent 6 days straight writing to Washington and waiting for answers that came a week after we'd already found our own way through. I told her about carrying wood in that temperature, the way the cold gets into your lungs with every breath and sits there, heavy, like breathing clay. I told her that the work that winter had been the kind that keeps you from feeling anything because there is no margin for it, and that afterward, when the thaw came and the margin returned, I had sat on the porch in the first warm afternoon and felt something very large and very old go through me, and I had not known what to call it at the time. She wrote back, "You don't need to call it anything. Some things just move through and keep moving. That is all they are." That was the letter I had to put down and pick back up 3 times. The letters went on for 3 months. There was a letter she sent in the 2nd month that I have never shown anyone. I will describe it but not reproduce it, because it was the kind of thing a person only says once and only says when they've decided you can be trusted with it. She told me that for the first year after George died she had been, in her own word, agreeable. Not grieving, not rebuilding, agreeable. She had visited her sister in St. Louis and agreed that the city was pleasant. She had been proposed to, gently and respectfully, by a hardware merchant in Laramie who was a decent man and had a good business, and whose face she sometimes couldn't quite call up when she tried. She had told him she needed more time. He had been understanding. She had never answered him again, not because she disliked him but because she had found, sitting at her kitchen table one October afternoon with the hardware merchant's letter on the table in front of her and a cup of tea she hadn't drunk, that the life on offer, the decent man, the good business, the town she already knew, was a life she could step into without difficulty and without any part of herself. She said, "I had become very good at not wanting things that seemed impossible to have. That is a useful skill and also a slow kind of dying." She said, "Your advertisement was the first thing in 2 years that made me want something specific." I read that 3 times and then I folded it and put it with the first letter, in the history of the Missouri River. I wrote back that I had spent 30 years making myself indispensable to a process I could not fully control, and that the skill required for that, the skill of being useful without being attached to the outcome, of caring without expecting, was also something that could become a slow kind of dying if you weren't careful. I told her I had come close to it. I told her the advertisement was not a moment of certainty, but a decision to want something specific again, which felt, at 62, both overdue and slightly reckless. She wrote back, "Good. I don't trust a man who isn't a little reckless about the right things." Then in a postscript in smaller writing than the rest, "I am keeping your letters, all of them. I put them in a tin box George used for survey notes. It seemed right, the box needed different contents." I thought about that for a week. The tin box, George's survey notes replaced by a Lakota agency superintendent's letters to a widow in Wyoming. I thought about what she'd said, that George's box needed different contents, not a rejection of what had been, a recognition of what was needed now. That was how she thought about everything I would learn, not sentimentally, not harshly, accurately. I will not give you all of them because some of them are not forgiving, but I will tell you what they were taken together. They were the beginning of knowing someone, not performing, knowing. She told me about her husband, not to mourn him in front of me, but honestly, the way you tell a new person about the person who came before so they understand the full shape of your life. George had been a good man and a poor husband, which she said was a combination she'd encountered more than once in the territory. Good men whose attention was always slightly past where you were standing, always on the horizon line on the next survey stake. She had liked him. She had been faithful to him. She had cried when he died. And then she had understood in the weeks after the funeral that the grief was partly about him and partly about the years, about what she had spent 22 years being and what she had not been and what she might still have time to become. She told me she had almost not answered my advertisement. I saw it 3 times before I wrote. First time I set the paper down. Second time I read it again and told myself it wasn't practical. Third time I thought, at 58, what exactly are you saving yourself for? And I wrote the letter. I told her about walks far woman. Not everything, some things you carry, as I said, but enough. I told her about the laugh you could hear across a river. I told her about the 21 years. I told her that I was not looking for a replacement because you cannot replace a person, and I was not looking to forget because forgetting is not something I have ever been built for. I was looking to go forward. There is a difference. She wrote back, "That seems right to me. I am not looking to replace George either, even the parts of him I would have liked to change. I am looking to go forward too. Maybe that is enough common ground for 2 old people to start from." I read that sentence so many times I could tell you what word was directly above the period. In the 4th month of the correspondence, I asked her to come to Dakota Territory. I am not a man who makes that kind of proposal lightly or carelessly. I thought about it for 2 weeks before I put it in a letter. I wrote 3 drafts. The first was too formal. It read like a business proposal, all the practical considerations laid out in order, which is how I write when I am nervous and covering it. The second was better but still too careful. The third was the one I sent, and it said, "Mrs. Prout, Dorothea, I have been writing to you for 4 months and I want to meet you. Not to inspect you and make a decision, and not to perform for you and wait to be decided upon. I want to sit across a table from the woman who reads seed catalogs in the winter and asks about sunset porches and doesn't think I need to know her age before she'll trust me with her name. I want to know if the voice matches the letters. Come to Dakota Territory. Stay as long as you need to decide. The house has the room. The porch faces west." She wrote back in 6 days. "I am coming. I will arrive on the 14th of September if the line is running, which it usually is. I am bringing 2 trunks, which I mention only so you don't think the volume of luggage signals anything about my character. I have accumulated things. George accumulated more, and then he died and left them to me. So now I have his things and mine and the things that are neither, which is a condition you may recognize. I will see you on the 14th. Dorothea." I read that letter on a Tuesday evening. I was on the porch. The light was doing what it does in September, coming in low and sideways, turning everything it touched the color of the inside of a copper pot. And the Missouri was about a mile east, and I could hear it, just barely, the way you hear a voice in the next room and can't make out the words but know someone's talking. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it and put it in my shirt pocket and sat there in the light until the light was gone. 14 days. I won't say I wasn't nervous. I will say I did not show it, which is a different thing and the thing I am better at. The train came into Bismarck on the 14th of September, 1886, at 20 minutes past 2 in the afternoon. I had driven the wagon up from the agency that morning, left before dawn, and I had a 2-hour wait at the station. I did not pace. I sat on the wagon bench and watched the platform and let the time go. The train was 3 minutes late. There were 11 passengers who got off. She was the 9th one through the door. I knew her immediately. Not because I recognized her, I had no picture, she had sent none, and I had not asked, but because of the way she walked. She came through the door and stopped, not hesitating, just taking a moment to look at the platform the way a surveyor's widow might look at a new piece of land, seeing it, getting her bearings, deciding what kind of place it was. Then she started moving. She was a solid woman, not heavy but substantial, the kind of woman who had worked with her hands and showed it in the set of her shoulders. Gray hair pulled back straight. A good coat, dark blue, worn at the cuffs. She carried one bag herself and was looking back for a porter with the second trunk, and when she turned back around her eyes went straight to me. I got down from the wagon. She crossed the platform toward me, and neither of us said anything for the first few steps. Then she was standing about 4 feet away and she looked at me, really looked, the kind of look that goes around the face and into it, and she said, "You're taller than I expected." I said, "You're earlier than the clock." She said, "The clock is wrong." I put out my hand and she shook it, firm and brief, and there was nothing tentative in it. Her hand was calloused along the outside edge, and her grip was the grip of a woman who had spent 22 years setting up camps. "Dorothea Prout," she said. "Caleb Iron Horse." "I know," she said, "you wrote your name in full," and she almost smiled, not quite, but almost. The drive back to the agency was 4 hours. We talked the whole way. Not nervously, not the filling of silence that people do when they don't know each other and are afraid of what silence means. We talked the way the letters had gone. One thing, then another, neither person performing. She asked me about the land we were crossing, and I told her what I knew of it, which was considerable, and she listened the way a person listens who is actually taking in information and not just waiting to speak. She told me about the train, about a woman she'd sat next to for 3 hours who had strong opinions about the territory that were almost entirely wrong. And she described the woman without cruelty and without sentimentality, and it was one of the funniest accounts I'd heard in years. The country opened up as we got away from Bismarck. That is the thing about this land, you don't understand what it is from the town. From the town it's flat and cold and not much. You have to get into it, out where the grass runs to the horizon unbroken, and the sky comes all the way down to the edge of things. And then you understand that it has a scale you can't see from inside it. Dorothea went quiet for a stretch when the town fell behind us, and I let her be quiet, and she looked out across the land for a long time. Then she said, "George would have wanted his instruments." I said, "To measure it." She said, "To name it. He always needed the name before he could have the thing." She paused. "I don't need the name. I just need the thing." By the time the agency buildings came into sight in the early dark, I had a picture of her that matched the letters and also exceeded them. The way a place you've read about looks both like what you imagine and like itself once you're standing in it. I had arranged for Yellow Hawk's wife, Mary, to be at the house. Mary had aired the upstairs rooms and made a supper, venison stew, cornbread, coffee, and when we came in she greeted Dorothea with the directness that Lakota women have, which is not unfriendly but is not fussing either. Dorothea greeted her back the same way, said the stew smelled right, and asked if she could see the kitchen. I stood in the doorway and watched the two of them move around the kitchen like they were measuring it, talking in low voices about the stove, and something in me, something I had kept very still for a long time, eased a little. We ate supper at my grandfather's table. She noticed the plain marks on the underside before I mentioned them, ran her fingers along the edge of the table when she sat down, the way you feel for what a thing is made of, and she looked up and said, "Old wood, planed by hand." I told her about my grandfather, the 4 horses, the long slow strokes. She listened. Then she said, "George would have wanted to know the tree. He'd have estimated the board feet and told me about the regional distribution of whatever species it was." She paused. "I didn't marry him because he was interesting at dinner." I said, "Why did you marry him?" She thought about it. "He was kind, and I was 26 and kind looked like enough." She looked at the table. "It was enough mostly." We stayed at the table a long time after supper. Mary had gone home. The lamp between us put the rest of the room in shadow. Outside, the September dark was full of crickets and the far sound of the river. She asked me about the Lakota agency, what the work actually was day to day, not the title but the content. And I told her without softening it. The ration lines, the enrollment disputes, the long chain of correspondence with Washington that moved slower than the weather and did less. The particular kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting the same battles in different forms for 30 years, and winning some of them, and losing more than you won, and still getting up in the morning. She listened without filling the space, which is the thing most people cannot do. When I finished, she said, "Do you think it will get better?" I said, "I think the land will still be here. The people will still be here. Whether the government will manage to stop getting in its own way, I've been thinking about that question since 1849, and I don't have the answer yet." She said, "George used to say that the land didn't care about any of it. Didn't care about the surveys or the treaties or the politics. Just kept being land." George sounded like he had some sense. "Some," she said, and the almost smile came again. "Not enough at dinner, but some." She stayed 2 weeks. I had told her in the letter to stay as long as she needed to decide. I want to be honest about what that 2 weeks looked like, because there's a version of this kind of story where 2 weeks is a romantic interval and everything shines, and that is not what it was. It was more real than that and more useful. She met the people at the agency. Not the officials. I didn't introduce her around as a prospect or parade her, but she was there in the house at the table, and the people who came to talk to me saw her and she saw them. Mabel 2 Hawks, who came twice a week with the enrollment updates. The Harrington boy, who was 19 and learning the cattle books and who was terrified of everything. Old Standing Deer, who came to the porch most evenings with his pipe and sat in the second chair, and whom I had never heard say much to anyone but who said, in Lakota, on the 3rd evening while looking at the river, "The woman sees." I didn't translate that for Dorothea, but I think she knew something had been said about her from the way she sat a little more settled after it. She helped in the kitchen without being asked, and without making a point of it. She read in the evenings. She had brought 3 books from Laramie. One of them was the surveying manual, which I found in the sitting room on the second morning and which I opened and read 4 pages of, because I wanted to understand what she'd found in it. And I did understand a little. It was a book about the precision of description, about finding the exact terms for what a piece of land was. There were margin notes in a different hand from hers, which must have been George's, and she had made her own notes around his. On the 5th day, she asked me to take her out onto the land beyond the agency. Not a tour, not sightseeing. She said she just wanted to ride and see the country as it was, not as I'd pointed out to her. So we went out in the morning, northeast along the creek, and I rode beside her and kept quiet most of it, and she kept quiet most of it, and we went about 6 miles out and stopped on a rise where you could see a long way in 3 directions. She sat on her horse and looked for several minutes without speaking. The September grass was going yellow-brown at the tips, and there was a line of cottonwoods along the creek bottom maybe half a mile east, leaves starting to turn, and the sky was that particular Dakota fall sky that is so blue it almost has a sound to it. Finally she said, "I understand why you stayed." I said, "It's the work." She said, "It's the land too. You don't fool me, Caleb." She hadn't used my first name before. She said it the way she said everything, plainly, like it wasn't remarkable, and looked out at the grass, and I looked at the side of her face for a moment. Then I looked at the grass too. I showed her the sunset on the first clear evening. We were on the porch at the right time, and the light came off the flats and hit the boards, and I said nothing, and she said nothing for a long while, and then she said, "All right. You weren't lying about the porch." I said, "I don't lie." She said, "I know. That was the other thing I noticed in the letter." On the 10th day, I asked her if she had what she needed to decide. We were at the table after supper, the lamp, the crickets, the far sound of the water. She said, "I decided on the 3rd day." I looked at her. She said, "I wanted to make sure I wasn't being impulsive. I gave myself a week, and then it was still the same decision, so I gave myself another few days to be absolutely certain I wasn't being a fool." I said, "And?" She set down her coffee cup, looked at me across the table the same way she'd looked at me on the platform, around my face and into it. Then she said, "You're the first man I've known who says exactly what he means and means exactly what he says and doesn't seem to think that's unusual. You've treated me like a person with a mind from the first letter. I've watched you work for 10 days, and I've watched you with the people here, and you're steady, Caleb. You're the steadiest man I've ever watched work." A pause. "And you kissed my first letter. Yellowhawk's wife told me she saw you." I sat very still. "She told me," Dorothea said, "because she thought I should know." I said I didn't know she saw. "People see things." She picked up her coffee cup again. "I want to marry you if you still want to marry me." I said I put the letter in a history of the Missouri River. She said, "You mentioned that in a letter." I said, "My grandfather's table, the porch, me." She said, "Yes." We were married on a Saturday in October 1886 at the agency by the justice from Bismarck who came out twice a year. Yellow Hawk and Mary were the witnesses. Standing Deer came and sat on the porch during the ceremony, which was close enough. The ceremony was short. Neither of us needed it to be long. Afterward, Mary had made the kind of dinner that a woman makes when she is genuinely happy about a thing, not just performing the occasion but putting her pleasure into it. We sat at the table until late. Standing Deer came inside and ate and said perhaps 15 words and seemed satisfied. The Harrington boy came by around 8 with a horse that needed looking at pretext, and Dorothea sat him down and fed him and talked to him for 20 minutes about the cattle books in a way that had him sitting up straighter by the time he left. I watched her do it. Watched her take a nervous 19-year-old and make him feel like he knew what he was doing, not by flattering him, but by asking the right questions and listening to the answers. When everyone had gone and the house was ours, we sat on the porch in our coats. October in Dakota Territory is cold. Not the killing cold of January, but cold enough. The stars were out in the way they get out here in the fall, not scattered, but packed, more stars than dark, the Milky Way like someone had dragged a cloth across the sky. She leaned her shoulder against mine, not a dramatic gesture, just there, her shoulder and mine and the cold and the stars. I had a particular feeling that I had not felt in 10 years, not happiness exactly, or not only happiness. It was the feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be, in the body you have, with the weight you carry, and having that be all right, warranted. Like the land knowing what it is regardless of what the surveyors say. I said, "You said I was steady." She said, "You are." I said, "I have spent 30 years watching the thing I was trying to hold together come apart in my hands, piece by piece. I have lost more than I can say in words. I am 63 years old and gray, and the work I do is slower than the problem. I don't feel steady." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Steady doesn't mean you don't feel it. Steady means you're still there. You're still at the table. You're still writing the letters and doing the work and getting up in the morning. That's what steady is." She paused. "And you're still here with me, on this porch." I didn't answer. She said, "That's enough. You've done enough." "More than enough." Her shoulder against mine, firm and warm in the cold. "You can let someone say that to you." I looked at the stars for a while. I said, "All right." That was all. That was the whole of it. The winter came in November, the way it does up here, suddenly and without much warning, 2 feet of snow in 3 days, and the temperature dropping to a place where you stop trying to measure it and just try to stay alive. Dorothea had been told about Dakota winters, and she had believed what she was told, which put her ahead of most people who come here from warmer places. She took to it methodically. She had come from Wyoming, which is not a soft place, and she had camped in country that would kill a careless person. She knew how to dress for cold, and how to move in it, and how to make a small house warm with the things available to her, which is not as simple as it sounds when the wind comes off the plains like something personal. I watched her figure out the stove, its particular temperament, the way it ran hot on the right side and needed the damper opened a half-turn more than you'd think, without asking me about it, just working it out by hand and eye. I watched her introduce herself in the course of that first winter to every woman at the agency, not socially, not performing the wife's role, but genuinely, one conversation at a time, asking what they knew and listening to the answer. There was a week in January when the temperature stayed below 30 below for 7 straight days, and the wind out of the northwest made it something else entirely, something you couldn't calculate or prepare for, only endure. On the 3rd day of that week, when I came in from getting the horses settled and couldn't feel my left hand for 20 minutes, Dorothea sat me down at the table and didn't make any drama of it, just worked the hand back methodically, rubbing in sections from the wrist, not saying anything, watching my face to see what was coming back and what wasn't. My hand came back fine. What I remember is not the cold or the fear of it, but her face, steady and purposeful, doing what needed doing. That week also taught me something about the nature of what we had, the two of us together. By the 5th day the cold had worked on everyone's temper, mine included, though I don't show it the way some men do. I was short with the Harrington boy when he made an error in the fuel tallies, and I knew I was being short and I couldn't stop it. He left looking like a dog that had been kicked. That evening Dorothea said, without any charge in it, just as a plain statement of fact, "You were harder on him than the error warranted." I knew that. I said so. She said, "The cold does it to people. It gets into the thinking." She poured coffee. "Apologize tomorrow and he'll forget it." I did, and he did. But what I kept was not the correction. I had known I needed to correct myself before she said anything. What I kept was the way she said it. No anger, no management of me, no performance of wifely concern. Just a true thing said plainly, one person to another. She trusted me to hear it and do something with it. That trust, the assumption that I was the kind of man who would hear a true thing and act on it, was the most respectful thing anyone had done for me in longer than I could name. I had spent 30 years being handled carefully by men who needed me useful and couldn't afford to push. Dorothea just told me the truth and left room for me to be the man she decided I was. She learned 10 words of Lakota by February. She asked Standing Deer to teach her, which nobody had asked him to do before, and he did it with no comment on the request, just began one evening on the porch, pointing to things and saying the Lakota name and waiting. She repeated. He corrected. She repeated again. By February she could say the fire is low and pass the bread and it is cold outside, which are admittedly the most useful things you can say in a Dakota winter. Old Standing Deer said to me in March, when the snow was still high but the light was starting to come back, "She is not what I expected." I said, "What did you expect?" He said, someone who would be afraid of it. I said, she's not afraid of much. He said no, and he smoked for a while, and then he said, she sees you, the same thing he'd said in September. She sees you. He said it the way you say something that you consider an important fact. I said, I know. He said, good, then stop working so hard at deserving it. I looked at him. He said, you have been deserving it for 30 years. It's here now, just have it. Spring, the Missouri running high with snowmelt, that turbid fast water that looks angry and isn't, it's just full. The cottonwoods putting out their first pale leaves, that green that is almost yellow, almost nothing, the most delicate thing the territory produces. Dorothea got a garden in by May. Not a big one, the ground was too hard and the season too short for ambition, but a real one, the kind you tend rather than the kind you plant and hope. She was out there most mornings before I was up, working in the low light, and I would find her at the kitchen table when I came down, her hands still carrying the smell of turned earth, reading whatever she was reading. One morning in May, she had the surveying manual open. I sat down across from her and poured coffee, and she looked up. I said, what did you find in it, the first time? She considered. The language, she said, the precision of it. George would read these manuals and see the practical application, where to put the stake, how to measure the angle. I read them and I kept thinking about how specific the language had to be to describe a thing that was always changing. Land changes, but the description has to hold. I said, that's what my work has been for 30 years. Finding language precise enough to hold a thing the other side is trying to make disappear. She looked at me. Yes, she said, I know. She turned a page. I think that's why I wrote to you. I didn't ask her to say more. I understood it. There is a thing I want to tell you, and I have been working around to it, so I'll say it now. For 30 years I was the person in the room that both sides needed and neither side saw. The government needed someone who knew the Lakota, who could speak the language and walk in the culture without frightening anyone, who could make the forms work and the meetings run and the rations calculated correctly. The Lakota needed someone who could hold the government to its word, or try to, which is not the same thing, as I learned, and who would not sell out for the small personal advantages the government was always offering. I was necessary to both of them and trusted by neither, not completely, and that is the place I lived for 30 years. There is a particular loneliness in being the necessary man that nobody owns. I did not complain about it. Complaining about it would not have changed it, and I believed in the work, believed that the small repairs I could make were worth making even when the large structure was failing. I still believe that. But there is a particular thing about being seen that I had not understood until Dorothea. When she said, you're the steadiest man I've ever watched work, she was not saying it to motivate me or to manage me or to keep me useful to her. She was saying it because it was what she had observed and what she found true, and she said it the way she said everything, plainly, because she had decided it was worth saying. She was not performing appreciation. She was telling me what she saw. I had not known, before that evening on the porch, how much weight I had been carrying in the simple act of not being seen. You don't know what it costs you until someone sets it down. That is the thing about a good woman who chooses freely. It is not the same as a good woman who is obliged to tell you you're good. The obligation makes the words hollow. Dorothea owed me nothing when she sat across my grandfather's table and said I was steady. She could have said nothing. She chose to say it, and to keep choosing, every morning and every evening, just by being there, and being real and treating me like the man she decided I was. That is the gift, not that she thought well of me, that she looked clearly and thought accurately and said so. It is 1889 now, as I tell you this, 3 years since the letter came on a Thursday. Dorothea is in the garden. I can see her through the kitchen window, the dark blue coat she's had since Wyoming, the set of her shoulders. She's staking something. The peas are up. The territory is becoming a state this year. Dakota Territory, cut in two and made into North and South Dakota, which will change very little for the Lakota and a great deal for the people in Bismarck who want senators. I have written 7 letters to Washington about the land provisions in the Enabling Act. 2 of them have been answered, which is a better ratio than usual. Standing Deer died in February. He went in his sleep, which is the death a man earns if anyone does. We sat with him the last week, Dorothea and I, taking turns, and the last evening he said something to me in Lakota that I will keep to myself, and then he looked at Dorothea for a long time and said, in English, perfectly good, which I believe was his full assessment. She took his hand when he said it, and he let her, which is the thing I will remember. The work goes on, the forms, the ration lists, the correspondence, the small repairs in the failing structure. I believe in it. I will believe in it until I am done, and then someone else will have to believe in it, and I hope they do. But I have something now that I didn't have before. Not comfort, not ease, not any of the softer words. I have a person at the table at the end of the day. I have someone who looked clearly and chose accurately and keeps choosing. I have the porch that gets the sunset, and someone to say nothing with on it. The letter that came on a Thursday. The woman who asked herself at 58, what exactly are you saving yourself for, and decided the answer was this. A man with gray hair and a grandfather's table, and 30 years of work that the world had mostly not noticed, and a porch that faced west. She was right, it was worth saving herself for. And I was here, steady as the land, waiting. She'll be in from the garden soon. The coffee is on. I'll hear the door.